Hi, Janika.
Hi.
How are you?
Great.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me.
So I'm super excited to talk to you about what you're doing. You are the founder of 4needs.net. Tell me more about what that is. How did you come up with it, and why did you start it?
Thank you for asking. I created the 4 needs theory as I was going through my college courses in psychology, social science, and education. And the teachers kept wanting us to pick these theoretical perspectives. And I'm like, I don't think it's right to just pick one. Right? I think you should take what's true from all of them and figure out what fits all over all the time, and not just be based on somebody's perspective. I'm kind of into hard science that way. I want it to be like facts and, not just anyway.
Right.
So I came up with the 4 needs to try and explain all the different schools of thought in a variety of theoretical perspectives.
And what are those 4 needs?
The 4 needs are really simple. It's like they're common sense, right? There's physical needs, intellectual needs, spiritual needs, and emotional needs. Everybody understands that at the core, right? Yeah. But what I've done is given function and specific descriptions of what each of those needs are. Where science has mostly focused on kind of intellectual, but mostly physical needs, like B.F. Skinner's, testing rats, based on their hunger and satiation and stuff like that. Well, those are just physical needs.
Right.
So, but we as humans have some higher order needs that, and just different types of need that are better. The animals aren't enough, right?
Not a perfect analog, right? The animals, right? We have the Maslow's hierarchy where you satisfy the basic things, and then on the top is like like fulfillment that people are striving to achieve, right, in their lives. Once you have the basic needs, satisfied, right, then your life goals and life fulfillment is the top need that you're looking for. Mm-hmm. So the 4 needs,
and definitely his theory did inspire me, and there is a structure based on that. I just have some clarifications and definitions, and I don't see it as a linear hierarchy, right?
So we're going to be talking today about those 4 needs, and you do workshops. And what do you do in your workshops? How people benefit from what you do?
I'm actually really in development. I'm looking for people to work on applications with me of the 4 needs. So whatever you're struggling with in your life, learning how to identify the needs that you might be lacking in or overcompensating with another type of need, right? So that we can bring you into balance, right? We want a holistic approach to personal well-being. So finding out what you're struggling with, and then having a community of support to help you implement the 4 needs and continue to understand how to apply the principles.
Right. So tell me a little bit more about yourself. You're a mother of 4, right?
6, actually.
All right.
Yes.
Well, I need to update my stats.
I had 4 with my first husband, and then I had twins with my second husband. And they are, I'm 47 years old. I love telling people that. I can't wait until I'm 50, right? Because
why is that?
I hate ageism. Like, seriously, I've lived a long time. I've had a lot of experiences, and that is something that I think should be valued. Right. So that's just
the wisdom of seniority of life.
Just experience as a collective, right? I've had a few more experiences. Now, other people have had different experiences that no matter what your age, those are valuable experiences. But I've got a bigger collection.
Right. Tendency is that the older you are, the more experiences you collect. That's not necessarily 100% true all the time,
and it doesn't include wisdom related to those experiences.
Right. So, this show, A Podcast with Interesting People, is kind of pivoting on that, is being anchored on that concept of talking with people who are sharing some of the things, life lessons, experiences in life that others can benefit from. So so looking back at your life and being a mother of 6 and developing what you're developing with those 4 needs and some of your background, what are some of the life lessons that you want to share with people that stick out, that you would be like, hey, if I could step back into a time machine and tell myself some of those things that I've learned in my life, what would they be like? Give me like top 3.
The biggest lesson I've learned is that the biggest obstacle that I had to overcome was this limiting cultural concept of that a woman sacrifices for her children and family, and that she has to choose between success and home, where men don't get that message, right? They aren't asked, how do you balance work and family? It's like they're just expected to go do work, that, right? And then the family is just there. But yeah, I would take a lot more time to acknowledge my own entity as a personal being and not have to have my identity so wrapped up in the role of wife and mother. And it might be that I'm bitter from 3 divorces, and but I'm really not. I just kept wanting to be married because that's what I had to be in order to be, this identity that was placed on me. And I was like, well, no, actually that's not the core of who I am. I'm Janika.
Right. Yeah. So who's Janika right now?
Oh my goodness, that's a series of podcasts that probably goes on for at least a week. But yeah, part of what drew me to the 4 needs, to understanding it, is that I have this really strong intellectual need to understand the world around me, and I want to explain things, and I want it to make sense, and it bugs me so bad when there's contradictions. Right. And so I'm like, this has to make sense. So that's my intellectual need. But then I had this, but I'm also highly emotional, and I want to connect with people, and I want to be significant. And then I have this spiritual need to live with purpose and help other people. And then I have this physical need to pay my bills and get food. And so I'd like to make money doing all of those things.
Totally least favorite of mine, of the needs, the physical.
Me too. That's a tendency that people that are spiritually focused tend to kind of dismiss their physical needs.
So the first thing you would tell yourself, if you could step back into the time machine, go back and talk to your younger self, and it would be like identity, and how identity, stepping out of that box, maybe that's kind of creating who we are and defining who we are in a way, right? Because once you have that, then you're less apt to try to step out of it, because you already have that box, so it mentally kind of limits you.
Right, yeah, all sorts of inhibiting thoughts from a variety of sources that were conflicting with what my soul knew I wanted to do. Right, I would think these things, and I would, and have like, a phrase that people who know me will often say is, my plans to take over the world, right? I see this big, huge world, and I just want to, conquer it, but more like fix it and help, people on a massive scale. And yet I felt like that was arrogant, or that I would become corrupted, or that there would be that there was a moral problem with me using my gifts and being all the crazy, amazing things that I thought in my own head.
Right. So do you think the identity is something that kind of precluded you or stopped you from going after that?
Yeah, the imposed identity definitely did that.
So that imposed identity, is it something because you're a woman and a mother, or is it like
part that, then some cultural and religious expectations, and then and another important element of that is that I've always been an emotionally intense, really out there kind of sparkly person, right? And like in school or even at home, it was like when I was too much, people would, hey, whoa there, take it easy.
To suppress some of that spunk out of you.
Right. And like I knew all of the answers to all of the questions in all of my classes, and I'm, doing the Hermione Granger thing, right? And insufferable know-it-all. That's what I was told, that I'm, that it's not okay to be that smart, and it's not okay to be that energetic, and it's not okay to be that talented.
Do you think that happens? Do you think that happens to a lot of women?
Not just women, as far as being, told
suppressed.
Be normal, average, mediocre is really what we're shooting for here.
Right.
Right.
So you think is that, well, okay, so, and again, is that just the sort of the culture influence? Is it what else is influencing that? And of course, how did you break out of that
that
virtual
is a
box
process,
right?
Still working on it.
Let's talk about
here.
that. Yeah.
So which question did you want to answer?
So how did you break out? How did you break out of that box? Or in the process of
right. So it's recognizing that the box exists, right? And then, so if we apply the 4 needs theory, which is that these social expectations, that's my emotional need. I need to belong.
Right.
To a group, and I need to fit their definitions. And what actually really made me snap was after 3 divorces, and I come from a family of, I had, there were 7 kids, and then my parents, and so there's all of these people in my life, and I felt like I had really tried to do things the way that I was expected, and I still felt abandoned and alone.
Really?
And I'm like, what am I doing this for? I have nothing to lose.
Right.
Nothing to lose. So I'm going to do and be whatever I want to be. The real me is okay to come out, because I already knew that I didn't want to build my that I didn't care what people thought about me. I just needed to belong in a certain group, right? And so I could be crazy and I could get rejection. It's confusing. There were these oppositional ideas, and I didn't know how to reconcile them, because my mom taught me that it doesn't matter what other people think. You can't expect everybody to like you. You just have to be nice. Right? That's a good, solid concept. And she taught me that I was a child of God, right? So I have this divine worth. So I don't need, other people to approve of me for that. So that was, my identity was solid there, except that I then over applied that cultural concept of, so to be this divine inner being, I had to be a mother, but that wasn't what my soul was telling me.
Right.
So
do you remember the time? Can you go back in time and was it a singular moment when you decided that, you know what, I don't care what someone else thinks, or I'm gonna be me? And what was it? Do you remember? Like, was it a one moment where you had it built up and you said I had enough, and right. I'm gonna be me now. Thank you very much. Or was it slowly trying things and pushing back slowly and then pulling back? And
yeah, it was a process. Yeah, because I know. Well, when I was in high school and middle school, I tended to be really exuberant, and I was labeled a spaz, and I was okay with that, because I was just like bubbling over with life, right? So why would I suppress my joy because other people are staring at me? In fact, I remember being in spaz mode and somebody's looking at me like, oh my gosh, she is crazy, right? And there's that acknowledgement that I'm seeing them see me as crazy, and I'm seeing them like being a little bit scared, but also seeing them be like, you're just doing that for attention, and it just made me laugh harder, right? So then I devolve into this maniacal laughter, and they're like staring at me like, wow. And it just keeps spiraling. The more you stare at me with that condescending, horrible look on your face, the more funny I think it is. Right. And yeah, I'm crazy.
And aren't we all a little bit crazy?
I would hope. I think it's better that way.
I forget who said it, but I think it was Alan Watts, one of my favorite philosophers, who said, and he was quoting someone else, he said, the reason why angels are flying or can fly is because they take themselves lightly. And I think it's a wonderful quote, which kind of reminds you, like there's maybe times when you need to be kind of serious, but don't
right.
Don't treat yourself too seriously. Don't be like, oh, this.
Yeah.
Because again, you're building your own box. But if we can be just playful, like look at kids. Kids, like up until some point, they're like just so playful. They don't care. They have a ball, right? They're enjoying life. And I think a lot of issues that people are having is just like they make that their own little prison, that cage in which they don't even see it anymore, and they just feel stuck. And
right.
They don't feel like they are themselves.
Yeah, and that brings me to another moment that I remember that actually flipped that for me. I was in San Francisco with my new husband, my first husband, and we were going to visit his uncle, and we had gotten off of the BART one stop too early. It's night. We've got our luggage. We're hauling it up the hill, and the streets of San Francisco, right? And he is so upset, right? And where I was raised with Murphy's Law. It's my mother's name was Randa. It would be just as aptly named Randa's Law. It's just we don't stress out about things going wrong. That's just the way life is. And so we joke about it. We make light of it. Life is fun. It's not a big deal.
Right.
Well, he was not okay with that. It's like, this is serious and I'm mad at you, and, you're not allowed to be happy and be okay.
Right.
Right. And so it was like, I was like, oh, this is my life now. It's like I lost a little piece of me died. I was like, oh, we can't have fun with things, even when things are bad.
Right.
Things have to be bad. Okay. And so that's where it began. And then I spent 23 years in marriages, trying to make guys happy that ended up leaving me anyway.
Right. So how did that influence your the development of four needs? Your model, was that, those were probably building blocks into it. What are you doing with it right now? I mean, I know you're starting like the workshops, right? And then so this
getting the book written is the main thing. And so I'm trying to get some more personal interaction with people so that I have some stories to tell and some applications that I can apply from real world experience, so people will.
Right.
So I'll have something to put in the book.
Right. So what is the book going to be about?
It's about the four needs.
Four needs, right?
Yeah, and it is, my intention is to have a series of books because the applications are pretty infinite, right? So you've got the four needs of personality, right? The who you are and how those four needs impact who you become, right? And then the 4 needs of government and politics, and that's much further down the road, because what matters is that people understand how it applies to them personally. So you can apply the 4 needs to business, and you can apply the 4 needs to education. I've done some of that too. So yeah, there's
is the majority of your work based on your life experiences, or are you combining them with some of the formal education?
It's very theoretical, intellectual.
Right.
Yeah, and I wrote my papers for my finals at the end of each of my college classes, and I was driving towards understanding this concept, and so I was trying to apply it in every class that I took, and so that's what I made my final about. And when I wrote them, I posted them on my blog, and it's all in hyper intellectual language that no one will ever be interested in.
Too dry.
Right. So. And just ethereal, conceptual stuff, right? And I like that because that's my intellectual need self, right? But I realized that I had to pull it down to something personal,
accessible to people,
layperson language, and with so that it wasn't just theoretical science; it was applied science.
Right. So what are so let's dive into those 4 needs. I'd love to just dissect them a little bit. Perfect. and do which one do you want to start with?
Let's go with spiritual needs.
Spiritual, okay.
Yeah.
You're going deep end of the pool. All right.
That's right.
Yeah.
Because when we understand that need, then we can. Anyway, spiritual needs are purpose, meaning. The functions are belief and then ideology, right? We have, when we envision concepts that, improve or that are just ideals, right? That's our spiritual network. And these are biologically measurable neurological networks in the body. That when we are visualizing and idealizing and driving towards purpose and meaning, then we're engaging our spiritual network.
Okay.
So.
And how do you satisfy that need, other than maybe belonging to a community or religious institution, or is it beyond that as well? It
really isn't about religion specifically, because religion actually more fulfills an emotional, social need, right? Because we're getting together as a community with this kind of concept of a shared spiritual vision.
Right.
So if you haven't identified personally, internally, and individually your own purpose, then you will connect on a really shallow level, religiously speaking. So you want your religion to be connected with a really strong heart-centered purpose. Right.
What do you tell people who are not, either not spiritual yet, or looking for that spiritual connection, or had it and lost it? What do you tell them? How do they find that?
So I'll actually divert a little bit, digress, whatever. One of the things that I recognized with 3 divorces, what happened to me was spiritual trauma, right? Because marriage is this concept that it's an ideal, right? And so everything that I hoped and believed, and it was deeply connected to my religious beliefs as well, was shattered. I had to redefine everything that I believed, because all of a sudden it didn't exist. I'm like, and that's why I jumped right into the next marriage. I'm like, no, I believe in this, and that marriage isn't that person, but marriage is still the thing, right?
Right.
But it actually wounded my soul in really profound ways. It damaged my ability to have a certain level of hopes and belief and faith. Right. And this happens all the time, right? In divorce, you start getting a little about fairy tales and things like that. And well, that's not real. And whereas before it was this beautiful, hoped for thing that you could,
It was this, it is within the confines of many religious institutions, marriage is considered a sacrament. It's a union that's before God, and so it carries not only this is not only a piece of paper that's signed and some kind of legally connects to people. It has that backdrop of the divine, of the spiritual. And so when it breaks apart, then you kind of like it also breaks that in a way, and that impacts you on that emotional level.
Right. And then so your question was, how would I, have people
reconnect find their spiritual
and
need?
First, you got to recognize that the need is there. Even if you feel like, because sometimes the problem is that you believe that believing was the problem.
Okay, explain.
If you had never believed in that, you never would have had your hopes and dreams dashed to pieces.
Right. Or not at least on that level, because it's not connected. If you wouldn't have spiritual ideas about that, then if a marriage breaks apart, then that just doesn't exist in terms of the spiritual aspect of that,
right? Because
you never had it.
Right, and not just in divorce either, right? Just with anything that you believe. There are a lot of people who are raised in a certain religion, and they, like, somebody will distort or violate what they have been taught, or teach things in a distorted way that presents that divine, however it's defined, but they will use it as a tool of manipulation and control. And so that leaves us with bitterness towards faith and divine, because it's
right.
That's yucky.
It's used now as a tool, as a mechanism.
Yeah, and so then the answer to your question would be to learn how to separate your core spiritual need from those social expectations, and understand that you don't have to believe these contrived sets of doctrines. You have to discover for yourself what you connect with.
Was that too a process for you?
Yeah, and interestingly, I still I have not felt the need to abandon the religion, but I've definitely learned to look at the religion as a separate entity from my relationship with God.
Right.
And that might be really healing for some people. I hope so.
Right.
I hope so. And then on the other side of that, people who either never developed a religious affinity, or have never really had any spiritual drive or experience, they're still manifesting spiritual needs, whether they recognize them or not. They may latch on to secular ideologies and adopt purposes about saving the world, right? So that's a spiritual need, right? Whether or not you're defining it as being God-given or religiously contracted or whatever, it's still your human need for spiritual experience.
Were there any other works that influenced you in terms of spirituality outside of, classical, whether it's Bible or
Right.
or is there anything else for those who, let's say, don't have that background as a sort of like support for the spiritual needs? Is there anything that you stumbled upon in terms of works that were like, wow, okay, that really fills me with ideas about spiritual needs? Anything that comes to mind that you think
that
or any work that made you think about that? Because it sometimes it may be not direct, right? It could be It could be reading a story about, I don't know, people in need or some kind of really traumatic experiences about someone, and you feel like, wow, it kind of it indirectly, and it may rise something up in you.
Right. So I can say that one thing, like I had this really strong spiritual kind of rebirth in my mid-20s, and I studied a lot of cosmology, and I read Hawking's Brief History of Time, and so that the creation and origin of the universe and those questions, which those actually tend to be more spiritual. Those are not actually scientific. That's still man looking for purpose and meaning in their place in the universe.
Right, exactly. And that's kind of like what I was thinking about as well, because sometimes when you look at your life day to day, and then you have a moment when you have some kind of an issue. You get on the wrong bus stop, and you're hauling your luggage, and you're like,
I hate that.
And then you're like, we're living on this tiny blue pebble that's floating in this space, this massive thing, and if you reframe your issue, sometimes it's just so minute that you're like, well, what am I getting upset over?
Exactly. Yeah. So I was influenced by those concepts of the universe, but I also really liked Joseph Campbell's myth.
Now you're speaking my language. Yeah.
So and that myth, symbols are a form of spiritual communication.
No doubt.
So when we are telling these stories of origin, we're communicating with something deeper than the intellect or even the emotions. There's this,
Yeah, mythology is used to describe the undescribable, right? I believe that's what Joseph Campbell was saying. And it was actually funny that you mentioned that, because I was just recently watching Bill Moyers interviewing Joseph Campbell.
Nice.
And there is a PBS special when they talk about, and that's what Joseph Campbell brought up. He said that, there's the things that we basically can't think in order to describe the undescribable. Call it what you want, whether it's God's, spirit, the universe, what have you. We can't describe it. There's no vocabulary. There's no words to describe it, right? And then the next step is the myths, the mythology, which is indirectly trying to point, sort of like poetry, which is talking about things, but not directly, because you cannot say that, but you can paint the tapestry around it.
It's to be evocative rather than explanatory.
And so it paints these road signs, these street signs that are pointing to it. They're not exactly saying what it is, but they're pointing to it, right?
Yep.
And so you get that. When you get poetry, that's what you get out of it. And then there is everything else that's left behind, which is just like our ordinary thinking, which may be just totally wrong, because it's just on that level below.
Well, and just to get, since we're going deep, so it's not, the theory is scientific, right? It's about being able to map the body, and that there's physiological experiences in each of the needs. They're networks that actually can be measured and studied. Okay. But then when we get to why those things happen, then we're getting into spiritual issues.
Right.
Right. So my why that is separate from the scientific physical theory is that the human body is wired with these capacities because there are physical truths, there are spiritual truths, there are emotional truths, and there are intellectual truths. And our purpose as humans is to discover those. And so we're given, that we're able to. But until we understand those individual functions, it's going to be a lot harder to find truth, and we're going to get things confused. So
right.
I'm a truth seeker.
It's a great journey, right? Isn't it?
It is. I love it.
So that's the spiritual needs, right? What do we want to tackle next?
Physical needs are easy,
needs.
Right? Right. That we have the need for, food, water, clean air, also safety. Safety is a physical need.
Right.
And that the functions related to that, all of our sensory experience, right, teaches us what's safe, what's not safe, we're learning how to meet our physical needs through our external senses.
Right.
So, it's physical needs.
Right. Well, let's not forget about sex.
Yes, and that is in the book, and that's there. So the parts of our body that are physical needs are, digestive function, air and respiratory, though there's some spiritual in the respiratory, right? But that, and then also sexual function, all those things are based on our physical needs.
Right,
yep.
right.
Yep.
And those are easy to sort of discover because your senses and your body and biology of of this vessel are kind of manifesting themselves like, hey, I need this, I want that, and so on. So those are fairly easy. Do you think people are? Is there any real need to, are people forgetting some of those? I mean, obviously you're not going to forget about breathing, you're not going to forget about food. Are there any other physical things that people forget about that they should have? Or what are some of the physical needs that you discovered that are sort of like counterintuitive maybe, or like that you would like not necessarily discover that, but they are still kind of needed? I'm thinking about one I'll share in a second.
What I found is that I actually am worst at meeting my physical needs.
Really?
Yeah, I will just go without eating because I'm so engrossed in,
something else,
figuring out an intellectual, theory, or I'm, creating some artistic work because art is a spiritual thing, right?
Right.
Or I'm so emotionally verklempt that I can't, that I don't want to eat.
Right.
So
I was thinking about one of the things that I would imagine is, I'm not sure if it's a need per se, but I think that I'm thinking about dancing and motion in general.
Yes.
I think
I actually was a ballet dancer.
People think like, physical needs,
Yes, exercising.
Just kind of like your basic needs, but I think exercising, motion, moving, how that impacts people, and especially a lot of nowadays people who are, working in the offices and have that
absolutely
sedentary kind of lifestyle, they forget about that. And
yes, thank you for bringing that up.
Body needs that motion.
And probably not just for physical reasons, right? But also having those, and then we're getting into a little bit of intellectual needs too. If you're just stuck in one space, then your sensory experiences become limited. So that, and sensory deprivation, right? People go crazy being in a black box and not having anything to touch or smell or feel, right? So they, or see, obviously, that's because we have a vital and fundamental need to process our external world.
Right. Solitary confinement is to be said one of the worst tortures imaginable for human beings, as we are craving that stimulus from the outside, the connection, right? Disconnecting it makes you question maybe even your existence. Right?
Distorts your ability to perceive because you don't have any physical reality to latch onto and ground you.
Right.
Right. So that's an important aspect of the four needs, is that it's about holism, right? We have all of these parts, but none of them exist independently. And we have to integrate them to be the most successful in being satisfied. If we oversatisfy one type of need and neglect another, then we're going to have imbalance. In fact, that's the trigger for addiction, because you're trying to satisfy, say, an emotional need with physical needs, right? Maybe the lab rats, I can't remember the guy who did it, but it was one of the more within the past 50 years. He found that he redid the studies on cocaine with rats, right? So if they were isolated, they pushed the lever over and over again because they had nothing else to stimulate them. If they had the rat parks and all this other socialization, they didn't go to the cocaine lever. So when we have our needs, when we diversify our needs and address the ones that need to be met, then we don't have just that. We're not the one trick pony, because it will trigger in your brain chemically. It'll say, it'll say, oh, okay, that was satisfying. More, when it's not satisfying the right thing. So it will never satisfy.
Right. There's going to be always some kind of a gap and void, because you did not address that specific need, a physical need, and so you were trying to find it in another place through another means.
Yeah.
So how do you keep? The question that comes to my mind is how do you have any tips or tricks? How do you consciously keep these four need groups in a balance, that you don't forget about one over the other?
That's a good question. How about if I develop something like that? Yeah, developing a system, because that would be a physical application of a spiritual and intellectual concept, right? Because we want to blend them all together.
Right.
And then so it would be really good to have
forming habits. I was talking to someone recently, and Taylor Proctor. She developed. She's a happiness expert.
Nice.
And she had a very, very detailed kind of breakdown of how she goes about building out habits around how to keep ourselves engaged with nourishing our happiness. And so I believe there's probably some kind of system that you can develop in terms of how to address those four. So it's like something to follow. So
yeah, absolutely.
Not sure if it's going to be like a daily checklist, but it could be something even.
Yeah,
like that,
I actually do have a daily checklist that somebody else developed about some other things, and that is a really, really useful tool that has helped me. And then that concept is the 5 kingdoms, and they're mostly social circles of influence.
What's 5 kingdoms?
That it was created by Richard Paul Evans, and it's that you have this central core of personal identity, and then you have your family and friends. That's the first kingdom is you, the second kingdom is your family, the third kingdom is your friends, then your associates, which includes business religion and school, all of your just associates and institutions. And then the fifth kingdom is the world at large, right? And so he created an organizer and checklist. And I've actually been working with him very closely on building that company, and which is really cool. But then I created a matrix on top of the 5 circles, because in each of those areas of influence, your family has physical, emotional, spiritual, and intellectual needs.
Right.
So,
I see what you're doing over here. It's like a multi-layered cake and overlay even over those domains.
Yeah, you take 5 circles and you put crosshairs on top of them.
Right, and divide. Yeah. So, okay, so let's talk about the next need.
The intellectual.
The intellectual.
We haven't done emotional.
We haven't talked about emotional yet.
So that'll be good heavy one. Let's do intellectual, because so the physical, the intellectual needs include reason and memory and sequencing, and it's making sense of the world, but then also being able to make decisions and take action based on those external sensory stimuli. Right. So with the stimulus, that we then have a choice. So that's what the intellect is in charge of, is making choices. And when we so that actually leads to our human need for independence and autonomy. We don't want to be told. We want to figure out stuff.
Right.
So, which is pretty contradictory to standard models of education. This is a domain where we can kind of I can dive into, because that's near and dear my heart, education and intellectual development. You have education, sort of your classical or standard approach, which is memorization, learning by rote. I'll give you data, you memorize it, you regurgitate it on a test, and I'll score you how well you memorize. Right. That's part of it. Not all of it, but a lot of it, right? And then you have the concept of games and gaming, making things fun, and how you can gamify some of the education, where you can have that discovery, the process of discovery of which is fun and engaging and challenging to a certain degree. And I think that a lot of that is just missing from our educational system. So, your thoughts on that? I have to be careful, because I'm a little too passionate about the concept of I tend to start saying things that make people go, what?
You need to say those things over here. On this podcast, you can say it all.
I have to be able
free.
to make sure that we say it in... Anyway, I love teachers, and I support them as people in their mission-driven purpose to help individuals. But the system is so broken, right?
There you have it, folks. A disclaimer. Here's going to be the good part. Yes, we all understand and know. Obviously, we're not bashing teachers. My mom is a teacher, so
both my parents.
I understand how difficult of a job it is, where you have certain limited resources and certain standard models that are forced onto you to follow, right?
Yeah. Big
and so you have already a box that you are put in as a teacher right off the bat. So it's
absolutely
it's difficult.
And then the students are given objectives and outcomes, right? That's what teaching is built around.
Right.
And in a compulsory education system.
Right.
We're being compelled to learn. Is it any wonder that children think they hate learning?
Right.
Where's the joy?
Right.
So it's kind of intellectual abuse, right? To constrain thought and to promote objectives without triggering inquiry, right? you don't ask them questions, you let them ask questions. And you don't require that they behave it this certain way, and because okay,
let it out. I want to hear it. Oh, I'm serious. Let it out. You clearly have strong opinions and some experience in that as a mother of 6 and trying to raise kids that are intellectually stimulated and educated and thriving in that, right? Not just beaten into their heads like what they're supposed to learn. And
the one size fits all model is so wrong.
Right.
So like my first son, we didn't even know until he was like 17 that he's on the autism spectrum. But I knew that expecting him to be like the other students wasn't working. He was absolutely brilliant. He had some very distinct savant traits.
Right.
But he wasn't...
He didn't fit in a standard mold of
he didn't. And he didn't socially integrate the same way other kids did. And so those are emotional need issues, right? But we'll talk more about that in a bit. But and then me personally, in my school experience, I never knew that, so I had an older brother and a younger brother who both got invited to take an IQ test when we were all in elementary school. There was 4 years between the three of us, and they were told their number. They had high IQs. I never took the test, so I assumed, okay, well, they're geniuses and I'm not, and it wasn't until I was in my 20s that I took a little Mensa thing, and I was like, oh, I qualify, that's cool. But then it wasn't until I started studying cosmology and getting really into just wanting to learn for the sake of learning because it was so cool and so fun that I was like, oh, I can figure this stuff out. I don't even have to have a teacher sitting there telling me, I read James Clerk Maxwell's treatise on electricity and magnetism. I haven't even taken, the math classes I need to understand all of the equations that are in it. And I don't care. I'm reading the words and I'm like, okay, I see how this is a language and I feel brilliant, right? Why can't we let our kids feel brilliant?
Right.
Let them pursue things that are interesting to them instead of saying, this is the subject we're all studying right now. Get out your books. And, Is
it because it's almost an impossible thing to solve because we're trying to bring structure to education, which in my opinion, education is nonlinear, and we're trying to, or even non-sequential to a certain degree, because we're trying to, everyone in lockstep, this is how you're going to learn, the end of a year, grade as you go into the next grade.
Boxes.
Right.
Yeah.
So it doesn't lend itself to, it's a remnant, it's a archaic approach that we're kind of inherited from the time where, you were going to schools and, everything had to be pushed at the same pace, and you had kids that, fell behind, and if they pass you with even B grades and, following years, they were they were falling behind because they didn't get 10% or 20% and they couldn't understand, the following material. And so I have some theories on how this should happen in the future and even now, because we have the technology to do that.
Absolutely.
But how do we change the mindset? Because it's such an institution, right?
It really is.
It's like it's a structured thing right now. So to change that would have to be like a major, heart
mental cultural shift.
Yeah, heart and brain surgery.
Right. And that is this is where I do want to take over the world, right? This is part of my master plan. Same thing we do every night, Pinky. All right. Good language. So to fix education, I don't want to try and fix education.
Do you think it's a throwaway and start from the beginning type of a situation, or
it's about creating alternative models? Because I originally went. After my first divorce, I'm like, well, I've got to provide for my family, and I don't have any skills other than being a mom, and so I better go back to school. So I'll be a high school science teacher. That's what I wanted to be. But as I studied education, I was like, there's nothing about this that I can deal with, right? I don't want to be part of that system. I just can't.
What was the biggest part that you said, like, all right, this is the straw that breaks the camel's back on the decision whether you wanted to become a teacher or not?
Just knowing that my ideas were never going to be valued, that I could only affect one classroom 1 year at a time. And I know that what I've discovered is important for a lot more than just one classroom at a time. So I really want to be able to promote that message on a larger scale.
And when you say what you discovered, what part do you mean?
With the 4 needs. And so the 4 needs of education is that we engage the child's intellect. We engage their physical, tactile, kinetic experiences. We engage their emotional, social well-being. We use symbolic learning and engage arts and music that are spiritual, so that it's an encompassing whole child approach to.
So there is a school that I wish we had one over here in Utah. Maybe we can bring it in over here somehow. In New York State, there is this charter school called the Quests. I believe it's called the Quest School.
Okay.
And it's a charter school. They still have to pass your whatever standard exams at the end.
Because the government
but
requires
the whole educational model is literally upside down in a sense that they gamify all of the education in that school.
Right.
So it's a fusion of subjects. It's not, like one of the examples that they give, which I found very fascinating, is they give kids tongue depressors and toothpicks and elemental components to make glues and all sorts of things, and they give them a challenge to build a bridge that's going to sustain a certain weight, and they have time restrictions, and the kids have to divide. They have to group themselves into teams. They have to decide what kind of management and structure. Like, is it going to be some kind of democratic or dictatorial or what kind of model of management, project management, and then they have to figure out how to make glue. So now you have chemistry with physics and math to figure out how all of this is like this fusion instead of these discrete subjects, right, that you learn in separate classes, and they compete as well against the teacher, and there's a monetary prize at the end of it. So it's like all of this is kind of, and that's how this is integrative. And so that makes me very hopeful that at least, and they've been fantastically successful. All of the kids are passing whatever the state requirements are in terms of, and it's fun, it's challenging, it's so all of that, and so that's kind of what I'm thinking would be great to if it would spread. And they've been doing it for quite a while right now, but I'm hoping that more awareness, maybe more conversations like we're having here today, that people would listen to, and maybe plant those seeds of thoughts about how we should start a conversation about how we should change our education system, how we should, or maybe like you say, start a parallel track. If this is too much to change, this model that we have right now that we're clinging to because it's producing such great results, maybe that alternate route is what's needed.
I think that's the only way to make a difference, is because the system is just too entrenched, right? You can tweak things here and there, but it's not gonna until it's like competing scientific theories, right? You have this track that is completely different, and then you have this track, and they seem to have nothing in common, but they do eventually converge by their existence, right? This one's over here, and the other one becomes informed by the different model. So we already have the entrenched, old century model.
Right.
So that has informed us on some other on the need for alternatives.
Right. Some things that work and some things that don't.
Mm-hmm.
So what else in terms of intellectual needs in your four quadrant model?
Yeah. Just processing and analyzing all of our, it's connecting our sensory experience to sensible explanations, right?
Explain.
So, there are very few people who know how to calculate a parabola, right? But there are some people who are better at it than others, but instinctively, we know how to watch the arc of a ball and predict where that ball is going to be so that we can catch it.
Right.
Right. So we're taking that information and converting it into projections and predictable concepts of what to expect from the world.
Okay, so are you saying connecting sort of like intuitive model of what's going to happen with, like when you said not a lot of people are, I can't imagine anyone calculating when someone is throwing a ball up in the air,
right?
And cranking out
your body already knows it.
Yeah, right. Nobody's cranking out a formula and trying to predict what's going to happen. They instinctively will try to figure it out real time.
Right, but because somebody figured out that there was a mathematical, that they could intellectually translate that experience into these formulas, we can then recreate worlds of our own through digital gaming.
Right.
Right? So how cool is that? But so those are intellectual endeavors. But then when we start creating worlds through gaming, we're also stepping into our spiritual needs for creativity.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was about to ask you, like, how do you connect the gaming world with spiritual with the spiritual, right. And that's the common denominator is the creativity of creating those worlds,
right? Of having it, of non-real concepts being transformed into an observable reality. Even though it's virtual, it's still an observable reality.
Right.
That you can test the models and you can say, oh, no, that's a glitch, right? That's not the way people actually move.
Right. All right, so what's left? Emotional
needs. Yeah.
Save the best for last.
So, I've always been a really emotionally intense person, but I was raised in a very intellectual environment. So I was taught to minimize my emotional needs. What we need emotionally are to love and be loved, but also to connect and belong, and then just experience that full range of, their reactions that we have that are internal, that aren't reason, they aren't explained by reason, they're just these chemical reactions in our bodies that create these reactions with us, right? So I was trained that emotions were something you could just turn off. And you know what? I did. But because my emotional need to belong in a family that didn't process things emotionally meant that I had to limit my emotional expression,
right, to
feel I belonged.
Why do you think your emotional responses were in an intellectual family were I don't know, thwarted? Is that the word? Or
minimized,
yeah. Or maybe
invalidated,
not as supported or not as encouraged. Why do you think that is, or that was?
There's that puritanical heritage that we have of that, that John Wayne stoicism of the era that my parents were raised in, which is a reaction to trauma, right? The people in the Depression that taught people to buck up and not feel anything, that was their coping method for trauma. So there's a whole cultural connection to the things that we think, feel, and believe.
So suck it up?
Right, the suck it up mentality, right? Plus, that cultural expectation of the masculine behavior. My mom was raised, she was the oldest of six, and she had 5 brothers. So her environment was very masculine and whatever. Besides that, her story is pretty, it's interesting, very cool. She was actually born with a facial deformity. And so, and her dad did migrant farm work in Idaho. And that meant moving to new schools all the time. So she's got this face that kids in the 50s don't get. And they weren't taught back then not to ridicule and ostracize people for being different. And
I'm not sure how effective they're being trained on that even nowadays.
At least
with
the
all
message
bullying.
is there, right?
On the internet. On the school's website.
Yes, on the school's website. And so, my mom prepared me. She gave the best anti-bullying message there ever was. She said, nobody's going to like you. You can't control that. So just be nice to people. That was, and she had this face, and people still liked her because she reached out, and she was good and kind and helpful, even though she was also aggressive and dominating and powerful, right? So there's these conflicts and contradictions because everybody has those. We don't actually fit in boxes. I can't stereotype myself. I'm a different person in every situation that I'm in. Right. So anyway, my mom's story. But she had this emotional trauma of not being liked. And so she had to cover it up with just being nice. And
you think that was a coping mechanism?
Yeah. So she shut herself down emotionally. And then it wasn't until after we found out that my son and I had a couple of nieces that were popping up on the autism spectrum that we were like, well, that's got a genetic component. And they're like, oh, Dad is autistic. We had never conceived of this before. But, he was fairly nonverbal, and he was, he was in the room with us, but he wasn't having conversations with us. He was like bobbing his head, and you could tell that the gears were working. Right. He was thinking real hard, but he wasn't sharing it with us. And he was just not emotionally demonstrative, right? So I didn't have these experiences I didn't observe emotional expression.
Right, you didn't have the models to kind of cling to.
Exactly. And so when I, was profoundly upset because I have bipolar chemistry, so I could become very profoundly upset very easily.
I'll keep that in mind.
I was like, and my mom goes, quit being dramatic, right? So these were real feelings that I was feeling, and my reaction appeared very extreme, but it was too much for Mom, right? It's like she believed that if I continued to behave that way, that I would be ostracized and that I would never be able to cope with anything in the world.
So a transference of fear in a way?
Right. So, and we just, whether we're transferring fear or just the models that we're familiar with, that's what inevitably happens. We just kind of project our life forward onto our children.
Well, that's inevitable in a way. I mean,
that's human culture,
right? And it's a kind of just like a pendulum is swinging both sides, right? Like if you didn't have something in your life, then you have a kid, then you want to provide all of that, so you overdo it.
Exactly.
And I speak from personal
experience. From the Boomer generation to the Gen X. Yeah, that's exactly how it happened. And as a whole cultural pattern, not just as a, this is what my mom and dad taught me. It just, everybody did it.
Yeah.
Which is why?
Right.
Because of all of our collective human needs as individuals, these patterns start to emerge.
Right. So would you say that when did you realize that the emotional development that you kind of sought in your family that wasn't as supported because of the history of your parents? When did you realize that was like, wow, that's a huge need, and I wasn't getting that at home, and that kind of explains maybe some of the things in my adult life. Right.
So when I got married, I was free to love and express and be more myself, except for not being able to be happy, because when things go wrong, you got to be sad. Life's complicated, right? We've got all these conflicting ideas, and we're trying to reconcile them. And that's really what the Four Needs is about, is trying to pick those apart and reconcile these things that don't make sense. So your question is that...
Well, we're talking about the emotional emotional
and
needs.
Being able to learn. So I often say references is my love language, because as a family, the way that we bonded was to watch. We had 5 movies on VHS, and we just watched them over and over again. And so...
Okay, wait. VHS?
What?
VHS?
Did I say that?
You're going to have to explain that for some of our audience.
It's a little black box.
Yeah, with magnetic tape inside.
Movies.
Movies. Motion pictures. So what were those 4?
So we had the really good ones: Princess Bride, Labyrinth, Blazing Saddles, and The Holy Grail.
Monty Python.
Yes. Plus the Parent Trap from Disney, and with the original with Haley Mills, and a few others here and there, right? But so as a family, because we were we never talked about meaningful, important things, but this is what connected us. So with just saying a line from a movie, we knew we belonged. That was our connection. We could say, "Oh, King, very nice. And how'd you get to be that?" And if you use it in the context of an actual conversation where it fits, then it's like, "Ah!"
Right.
So that's my form of emotional bonding and connection. And my third husband was like, "Why do you quote movies all the time?
Right.
Like, I don't. That turns me off." And I'm like, "But I'm connecting with you. Aren't we connecting?"
Right.
So, but I did start to be able to just really gradually free myself from emotional constraints. But how's our time looking? Because I got a little story.
Yeah, no, we're good.
So because I was so emotionally blocked, when my first husband told me on our 11th anniversary that he'd never been in love with me and he was tired of living a lie, I was in this state of shock and just like totally numb, right? Totally unable to emotionally process anything. And then things started coming out, and so I had pieces to put together, right? Because what he said just didn't make sense. Everybody that we knew was like, what? You guys are like the perfect couple.
Right.
You know, sitting next to each other in church and, very affectionate. And, it's like, we're good. We don't even fight. What's going on here? Right. So instead of emotionally processing, actually feeling the pain and devastation and loss of my hopes and dreams, I had to figure out why. I was intellectualizing, I was rationalizing, I was trying to explain it. And since you can't actually satisfy an emotional need with intellectual things.
Yeah, with rationalizing it.
Mm-hmm. What happened was I tripped myself into a psychotic episode because it was me. It was an outrageous experience. I was on the streets of Shreveport, Louisiana for 28 hours, talking about, knocking on doors in questionable neighborhoods and, talking to people about this big conspiracy that my husband was in that was connected to the Abu Ghraib prison scandal, and that he was a child molester and a serial killer. And, that's what my brain decided. That was the only explanation for why he would leave me. He'd been living this dark, horrible, awful secret life. And that made me feel, that allowed me actually to process my emotions. Wow. by feeling anger. And even though the thought never, ever crossed my mind, because, that I am so angry that I want to kill this man. That thought never consciously went through my intellect, but I felt it. And so what I came up with was a whole story of why he absolutely deserves the death penalty. We can legally kill him because he's so evil, right? And so, so there's like volumes of things that happened in those 28 hours. That's like, and I remember all of it. That's pretty rare.
I think that's a book.
It is. But I've left it alone. That was almost 18 years ago. But it's just like, no, 15. Anyway, it just...
That is an interesting thing, though, how because of emotional and, I don't know, maybe like not having the emotional tools to deal with it,
right.
And because you grew up in this highly intellectual environment, your brain literally switched into using intellectual tools to trying to process that. Yeah. That is very interesting.
Yeah, and it's taken me a long time to put all of those pieces together after the fact. Right. I just know that after I came down, that
of course that made you sound crazy, like totally crazy.
What?
Because but it's a coping mechanism, and if you understand the framework, what's happening in the history in the background, then it totally makes sense, right?
Right. Well, and that's the thing that I would like to be able to be acknowledged with crazy people, right? There was a story in my head. It completely made sense. And I can even tell you the story and convince you of it. If I were to, oh my gosh, that's so like, it'd be a great, novel
and so
or whatever.
Judge, then he did this.
Right. But it was all circumstantial evidence, right? I was like, my brain was literally, I could almost feel the neurons like sparking with these ideas of, oh, that's what, and, I'd take this little tiny piece of something that happened, and go, that's because, and it's just like, it was exciting. It was it was like psychoactive drugs, right? And I knew I wasn't behaving fully like myself. So that's part of my explanation for my psychosis is I had surgery, And during that surgery, my husband had gotten together with the doctor who he was related to implant me with these time-release drug capsules.
Oh my goodness! This is totally a book.
And it was bugged, and that there was a microphone implanted in me so that they could hear me, and that's crazy, right?
Or at least a good sci-fi story.
It's fantastic, and maybe that's where all good sci-fi stories come from.
Yeah.
Just saying.
Episodes.
So
how did you recover from that? Like, what happened? Was it just like this rush of emotions channeled through this intellectual valley that kind of created all of that, and then at the end, you like as the emotions kind of came down, how did you come out of that? So
I finally put myself in on lockdown with a 72-hour voluntary.
Right.
I'm like, I need help. Even though I still was pretty convinced that everything I was saying was absolutely true, I knew I needed help. And I knew people weren't going to help me unless they, check in. So I got in, and the admitting doctor had me explain everything. He took the time and he listened, and he nodded and said, "That sounds pretty far-fetched." And they'd already given me the medication, and that's about when it set in, and I slept it off for I don't even know how long. Right? Because part of my problem too is sleep deprivation. But then they kept me for 2 weeks. But I recognized, within, 72 hours after that, I came back to reality, and I recognized, and I was actually already joking about it, right? I'm in with the rehab people, and they're like laughing at me hysterically as I'm like, and my ex-husband and blah, blah, we weren't even divorced yet, but I'm like, this is how, and I'm just being open and honest and telling it all. And, but it did actually take me a solid month afterwards to evaluate what was actually real versus what I had perceived, because the way those neurons were firing created some really deep, really fast
networks.
Yeah. And so I had to find ways to I had to dismiss all secondary evidence, all the circumstantial evidence, right? I had to say only things that I can physically prove are anything, and so I had to just double check and make sure that my children hadn't been molested, that I had, I had to go through that process, but I wasn't going through it trying to prove that I was right. I was just trying to figure out what was real.
Right.
So
deconstruct some of those things that your brain built up in this highly emotional, stressful place that you were.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's been a while since I visited that, and that's why I haven't written the book either, is because some of that is just really hard.
Right. Because you're going to be revisiting some of those events and memories and things like that.
Yeah.
Are you afraid a little bit that that may trigger something?
No, not at all. But that was one of the important parts of healing was, well, first of all, I was taught by the doctors that I now needed to be permanently on medication to prevent this from happening again, because they didn't understand the nature of the situation. Right.
So the fix was, here's some medication to help you with it.
Yeah.
Are you still on it?
No, I stopped like a month afterwards. I stepped myself down, and the doctor was mad at me. That was really dangerous. And I was like, yeah, but it's making me so I can't play the piano, so I'm not going to keep taking it.
Right.
So priorities, you know what I mean?
Right.
I'd rather be crazy than not be able to play the piano.
Hey, who knows? I mean, maybe playing piano, playing instrument was
more therapeutic.
It's more therapeutic and a way of rewiring your brain. We all know the effects of music on neurogenesis.
Yep. So so where were we with that?
So emotional skills, emotional needs, and that whole experience that you had, that you just shared, and how that influenced maybe your development of emotional skills, or like learning more about how important they are.
Yeah, recognizing that, and okay, so I can construct things intellectually and make it all make sense, but then applying it has been a much slower process for me, right? I've had these concepts in my head for a solid 10 years. And
explain.
So I can reason something out, right? And I can see that this theory and this theory and this theory all address different aspects of human need. So if we just understand all four needs, then we can integrate these theories, right? So I can, I wasn't looking for a personal solution to my own problems when I created the theory. I was trying to solve the world's problems. Right. And so after I, figured out how the entire world works, then I was like, well, why isn't my life working? If you know all of this, then where's the results?
So what did you find?
You need to be your test subject.
Right. So what did you find out?
I found out that there's a difference between knowing the path and walking the path.
Right.
So, but that every human is going to struggle through those applications. It doesn't matter how well you conceive something.
Right.
You still have to live it. And that process can be painful and definitely difficult. And there's so much contradiction and conflict to sort out that you have to, breaking through old models and stuff is, that's a challenge. It doesn't just happen just because you think it. Right? You have to apply each of the needs, right? So I understand intellectually that I have an emotional need deficiency, but it's not enough to just know it.
Fix it, right?
I have to learn how to be just horribly upset when I'm actually upset, and to not feel bad about acting out. And, emotions are not bad. Emotions are a thing that you have to experience. You just can't get away from them.
Right.
So
how did you figure out? So what are you doing now to figure how to cope with them, or how to address those needs? What are you doing now? Do you have anything that you want to share, like how, and any things that you do, anything that helps you remind yourself how to address those things, or how to continue to develop them? So,
like when it's recognizing when I'm avoiding is really the main thing that I've had to do. Like
avoiding,
when things are emotionally challenging,
right?
Then I'll start playing my game.
Okay.
Right? If I'm on my phone scrolling through Facebook or playing Toon Blast, that means that I'm in avoidance mode. So I gotta be brave and put it down and sit and, breathe a little bit and say, okay, which emotion are you avoiding right now? What's hurting? What are you avoiding? So
it is an intellectual approach of noticing that there is some kind of an issue, or
because I'm an intellectual person,
right?
So people who people who are physically focused. They're the kind that are going to want to get out and just go do exercise or go to work, and they're going to tend to be workaholics. And they'll if they're having problems at home, they'll tend to stay at work longer and try to increase success there. So noticing when there's an imbalance requires recognizing that you have certain patterns. And so when your personal patterns start popping up, then you can say, what needs to be fixed here?
Right. But isn't it sometimes difficult to do that, because it's like fish swimming in a pool, or
right,
where you
yes.
can't even see the water that you're in because you're just like your environment. So probably not the best example that I wanted to bring, but you know what I mean, right?
I absolutely know what you mean, and that does bring me to so my fears of my emotional needs not being able to be met because my social circles didn't validate my emotions. I actually had to find a new circle of friends. I had to find like-minded people that I could communicate with. And that's something that I did start connecting with the Kingdom Organizer community. And I would also like to create a Four Needs community so that we can support each other in acknowledging our challenges and supporting each other in change, because change feels unsafe, right? We talk about the comfort zone,
right?
Because we inadvertently make this connection with physical safety. That's a physical need, and then our emotional belonging. We want to. We can't break out of old patterns in our old communities.
Right. So in a way, one of the solutions is actually an external solution, building a sort of social support network.
Absolutely.
Where people can bounce the or indicate or help you notice those moments where you are. Yep. And that's where my wife is a mental health counselor. So
good.
So I think that's what's beneficial about their work as well. I mean, among many other things, it's just that it's that impartial third party that can notice things that you can't notice yourself.
Right. I think it was Albert Bandura that did the studies that recognized that people are just horrible at self-perception. Right. Whereas I think I'm better than average, I still acknowledge my blind spots, because I do all the time. I'm like, are you right about that? Do you question yourself, right? But there's
Why do you think you're better than average?
Because I question myself. Where people who say, oh, I know I'm right, I don't have to, analyze that. But I do. I actually am really open to saying, okay, that's what you believe. Why do you believe that?
I see that maybe your traumatic experience kind of maybe created a that mechanism as well to kind of question it.
Yeah.
So see something good that came out of something bad.
Oh, absolutely. Right? And full disclosure, that what happened with me in my intellectual upbringing was that my bipolar instability, I was trained for how to cope with it. I've never taken medication. And it wasn't until I started taking my own psychology classes that I realized that they called it a reactive psychosis after my husband and I, but it was actually a bipolar manic psychosis. So that was me in my most extreme state, because I'd been so repressed from letting my body be able to actually process those things. So I learned to be my own medication, which is pretty powerful.
Right. No, that's
So because I had a secure, I had a secure sense of belonging, and my mom, she absolutely loved me. There was none of that, you know. It was just, she accepted who I was and taught me my internal innate value. Right. And then she didn't say, well, you should wear something pretty so the other girls will like you. You know, it's like, no, none of that. Blah.
right.
Right. So that security created just absolute trust. But I internalized it in an extreme way. So I actually have a really high pain tolerance too. Because, I'm like, I just, ow. And she's like, are you bleeding?
Right.
It doesn't hurt. Quit crying. Right.
I don't see a bone sticking out, so it's fine.
Mom says it doesn't hurt, so it must not be that bad.
Right.
But that made me bad at self-perception as far as being able to judge my own pain scale, right? 1 to 10, how are you feeling? 2, okay, but there's blood in your urine. How are you feeling?
Right. Right.
I don't know.
Yeah. Isn't that amazing that the brain and all these different perceptions that we have can be so manipulated. Actually, there was, I think, an experiment by, and I forget the name of that psychologist, but it was literally like through almost like hypnosis. It was an experiment. Trying to think of the name of that psychologist. It'll come back to me. But the bottom line is the experiment was like holding your arm in a bucket with ice water and ice, and through conversation that he had with two subjects, and literally the pain threshold, like one could just lift the arm at whatever point they wanted, and the other person they were talking to and literally reframed what pain was for them. So they were able to keep that arm in that ice cold, bucket of water just by kind of reframing how their brain was perceiving pain.
Right.
So
yeah,
it's amazing that our brains can do that. And clearly just what you described is an example of something like that.
Yeah, so that's I'm fascinated with all of it, and that's where the 4 needs comes from.
Zimbardi was
okay.
Yeah.
Zimbardi. Okay. What was his nationality?
Yeah.
You know?
I think he's an American psychologist, but he did a lot of interesting experiments. He's the psychologist that did that famous experiment where I think it was at Stanford, I believe in my memory, where they had some students pretend to be so they built like this mock prison, and they had some students pretend to be inmates, and the other students. That was his experiment, and then what was happening to them as they embodied the roles of the guards and the the submissiveness of the
pain.
Right. And so that was interesting. So again, going back to what our brains can kind of change the perceptions of things,
And that's why I created this construct for us to perceive these needs so that we can reset our brains to understand and make sure those needs get met.
Right. So let's get back to that. Let's tie all of this together, right? So we have all these 4 quadrants, four groups of needs, or 4 needs: emotional, intellectual, physical, and spiritual.
Right.
And where are you taking with this next in your journey of building this out and teaching? Are you going to be teaching this? I know that you're starting like workshops and
right. I would love to not only work with people in groups and as individuals in recognizing and understanding this and how it applies personally, but also to train others how to use the methodology and apply the principles.
Right.
So do some integrative research with actual applied experience. Because where I am now is theoretical, right? Except for my own personal experience. So I want other people to work with me and see what kind of impact it can have for them, and then be able to write the book which I actually have most of it written. It's just a matter of putting those pieces in there too, seeing if it's valid and confirmed, and then take over the world. No, wait, what?
So where can people find out more about? Well, I guess we have it in your title over here.
Yeah, forneeds.net.
So forneeds.net, and what can people find out over there?
It does give kind of what we've talked about, just a basic overview. And then it does have my contact information on there, so you can get with me. And I will be posting more schedule things. And I have some blog articles and stuff that I'll be keeping up on. And
any workshops? Any plans for doing group workshops with people that are interested in exploring this with you?
Yes, absolutely. So I do have a meeting at my house every Tuesday night, so you can contact me about that, and we will expand as needed.
All right, I think that's where we can take off. That it was a very interesting conversation. Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for being vulnerable about this experience.
I just got nothing to hide, right?
I think it's. We live in this age right now where podcasts like these, where people get to know other people, and I think people willing to be vulnerable and talk about their experiences for the benefit of other people. Because
that's my hope, right? Because we learn through experience, and we can learn through personal experience, and we can learn vicariously. So I really hope that the more open and honest that I am with my experience, the more people can pick up and learn for themselves whatever they need to learn, where it applies to them.
Great. So there you have it, folks. Take a look at Four Needs. There you go. I was going to go 4 sentences. forneeds.net, where you can learn more about the experiences that we talked about and what's coming for you in the future, and what you're going to be sharing and doing in this space. And thank you for being on the show and being vulnerable and being and sharing all this good stuff with everyone.
Thank you for being an excellent host and interviewer. Much appreciated. Loved it.